Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is part 4, chapter 4, part 1 of my newest book, which will be hopefully released before the year is out. It is provisionally titled The Wolves of the Irish Sea, and this part is called The Fall of Viking Dublin 902. Ragnar Iverson of the Uya Mare closed his eyes and inhaled a calming breath of familiar sea air on the docks of Dublin. Seagulls fluttered in the breeze, and the sound of the Irish Sea drowned the noises coming from the hustle and bustle of the city. It's great to be home. The weather was reasonably clement, and all of the fishermen were crying their catch on both sides of the river. As he made his way to the centre of the city, from where his men had tied up his longboat on the Liffey, Ragnar could see that the city was thriving. Dublin was a massive city, the only settlement that truly could be called a city on the island of Ireland, and depending on what time of the year it was, hosted as many as 60,000 people. Danish blacksmiths, Irish farmers, Frankian traders, and spice and silk merchants from the Mediterranean Sea all jostled shoulder to shoulder and traded what they could. Ragnar had a busy day ahead of him. He had just returned from 4 weeks at sea from a successful raid on the Saxon coastline. His father, Ivar, had commanded him to hit the coast of Somerset, and they had taken many slaves. His father, brothers and cousins were all fighting in the Danelaw in the Saxon Civil War, and Ragnar had been commanded to harry the west of the Saxon kingdoms to make Edward the Elder think twice before leaving his western lands undefended. Ethelwald's revolt against his cousin, the elected King of Wessex, continued apace, with no side looking yet likely to achieve outright victory any time soon. The Danes and Saxons of East Anglia and the Danelaw had backed Ethelwald, and with the help of his Viking allies, the usurper looked like he could potentially win. The Saxon kingdoms were a maelstrom, and both Ivar, son of Ivar, and all of his sons and nephews were taking full advantage. Ingemundr Baridsson, Ragnar's notorious cousin, was raiding and pillaging up and down the Severn River, which served to dampen Queen Ethelflaed's commitment to fully reinforce her brother. How could she leave a warrior as formidable as Ingemundr, devastating Mercia, behind her after all? Ragnar's father and brothers, Ivar and Amleab, were ravaging all the villages and forts along the river systems throughout Wessex. Ragnar, as the youngest war leader, had been given the task of harassing the Somerset coast south of the Welsh kingdoms, with strict instructions to take as many slaves as he could. Through Ragnar, his father was monetarily hedging his bets with Ragnar's raids, for even if the civil war turned against their puppet Ethelwald, Ragnar would loot and plunder enough for all of them. No matter what, it would be financially worthwhile. His younger cousins, Eric, Gunnar, and Garangar, each served under seasoned captains within his own command, making their first forays into the Irish Sea as Vikings. It pleased Ragnar that he had his own command, even if it was only 10 longboats in strength. When his father had told him what he was to do, away from the main strength of the Vikings of Dublin, he could tell at the time that his brothers and cousins felt that it was an insult. His father was always hard on him, whether it was because he looked exactly like his famous grandfather Ivar the Boneless, or because he went with men instead of women, or perhaps the fact that he had already been part of several famous battles on the winning side, and in ways his own fame had surpassed his father's reputation already. Perhaps it was simply fear, he chuckled to himself. He was the best fighter of the Uya Mare, after all. He had taken the heads of Sigurd the Mighty and the Iron Knee to prove it. What other Viking could claim to have killed 2 fabled warlords before they had turned 18 years of age? Ragnar Uya Mare was a name that commanded fear and respect from Norway to Limerick and everywhere in between. The hall of his father and mother lay on the south side of the river Liffey, high up on a prominent hill overlooking the river and city. Dublin was truly enormous. It was a massive source of wealth for not just the Vikings, but the Irish who traded with them in the hinterlands. His father had made several brilliant moves politically that made Dublin the city it was. By marrying Gudrod Skirja, the daughter of Harold Fairhair, he had unified the Danes and Norse in the city to such an extent that when Ragnar killed the Iron Knee, there were few calls for vengeance. Even Earl Sigfrid had joined the joint Norse ruler with the Iron Knee, had conceded that with his former ally out of the picture, there could be an enduring peace. The Earl had ceded control of Dublin more or less to Ivar in exchange for a part of the taxes collected from trade, and mostly served now simply as an advisor to the Uia Mayor. All Sigfrid's sons had died in battle in the intervening years, and he had acknowledged Ivar Ivarsson as the one who would inherit all once he passed on. Dublin would be unified. When Ivar and Gudrun Skirja started to have many sons and daughters with both Norse and Dane heritage, it had further unified the city. The inhabitants were no longer Norse and Dane, they were now just Vikings, the foreigners or Norse Gaels of Dublin. The Irish for 20 years had called them by a different title, and this one had spread far and wide across the Irish Sea. All the Vikings of Dublin were simply called the Uia Mair. Ragnall's father had not finished there. He had married both of Ragnall's older sisters to Irish kings to keep them from encroaching on his territory. Both had come with massive dowries. Estrid, Ragnall's older sister, was married to a chieftain of Cuala, Conal MacFinn, and the other, Bodil, was married to a young up-and-coming prince of the Lagan called Aguera Macalilla of the Ué Dunlanga. It was Ragnar who had arranged that latter marriage the year before, as he was very familiar with the lands and people of the Ué Dunlanga of Leinster. He regularly visited with his sister to check on her welfare, but there was an ulterior motive as well. Aguera Macalilla had a brother who lived in his shadow, a quiet and considerate young man who was destined for the monastery, but to Ragnar he was a special friend. When Ragnar went on raids, it was not frowned upon to take women by force. It was positively encouraged, but he was never attracted to women in that way, and only saw captured women as chattel for the slaver's block rather than targets to be ravished on a raid. It had been a confusing time for him as he grew to manhood. He had told his mothers and sisters first, and they had never cared and just wished for his happiness. It was not illegal in the Viking world to go with men, but it was certainly deemed unusual and dangerous in ways if he could not produce any heirs. Ragnar didn't care. He had many brothers who he knew would go on to have loads of sons of their own. When he told his brothers and cousins, they had also shrugged their shoulders indifferently. His father, though, was nonplussed and warned him that fathering children was a responsibility for a Viking. His father impressed upon him that to live his life eschewing women for the company of men, he would have to absolutely excel as a fighter, or Viking warriors would not respect him. But that was no problem for Ragnar. He was 6'4" and bore the inherited white stripe of hair that occasionally turned up in the line of the Uia Mair. He was ambidextrous and could fight evenly with either hand, which was a terrible surprise for any foe he faced. His joints were extraordinarily flexible, and he was capable of amazing feats of acrobatics. He had mastered axe, bow, sword, and spear, and he had earned renown in every battle he fought. Men followed him because he always brought them the three things that every Viking warrior wanted above all others: victory, wealth, and reputation. His father's hall was long and wide and dominated all of the hundreds of dwellings that surrounded it on this section of the river. As Ragnar's brothers had grown older and his sisters had married, they had moved out, but he had remained quartered at home. He had never longed for a hall of his own and much preferred the freedom of his longbow. All that remained at home were Ragnar, his parents, and his youngest brothers, who were twins. They were between 9 and 10 years of age and looked up to all of their older siblings, hoping one day soon that they could take to the seas and live the Viking way. Ragnar entered through the large wooden double doors of the hall, and although there was a fire in the central pit and a pot bubbling away, neither the twins nor his mother were inside. He moved to a small door at the back and stepped outside once again. His mother had set up a large Viking loom out in the light and was intricately weaving patterns for a new blanket. His brothers were fighting with miniature shields and wooden swords. They were energetically battering at each other, laughing all the time, but as identical twins, each were as accustomed to each other's footwork that neither could gain an advantage. Ragnar snuck up upon them and tackled the two to the earth. "Ragnar!" they shouted in delight, and wrestled with him upon the ground. After a minute, Ragnar submitted to the two twins, and the trio picked themselves up and dusted themselves off. His mother looked on beaming, but allowed him a few more moments with his twin brothers. He unlaced the sack that he had set down before. He playfully ambushed his brothers and unveiled the presents he had for them. They were two small steel curved Saracen swords. He handed one to each boy to oohs and ahs as they examined them. They had known weapons all of their young lives, but they had never seen the carved scimitar blades of the warriors of Al-Andalus. His mother finally interceded at that point as the twins began clashing with their new swords in feigned battle. "Be careful, you two," their mother warned them. She turned to Ragnar. "It is great to see you again, my son. I prayed to Odin for your safe return." Ragnar laughed. "What Saxon could ever hope to kill me? Godfred and Sihtric would give me a better fight." His mother laughed and guided him inside and sat with him by the fire. He told her all about the raid, the slaves taken, which men had been wounded, and any other plunder that they had seized. His mother in her prime had been a shield maiden and fought beside her famous father and brothers. She was Harold Fairhair's eldest child and had married Ivar Ivarsson at 14. Their son Ivar had been born soon after that, and Gudrod Skirja had settled for a sedentary life in Dublin, raising their children, while her husband went on campaign every raiding season. They spoke together for several hours, during which the morning turned to afternoon. At length, Ragnar knew that it was time to take his leave. His slave stocks were corralled down close to the docks in stockades under guard by some of his warriors. They would have to be fed and watered, but the inherited cost of keeping this stock around, he hoped, wouldn't hang over him for too long. Representatives of two of the Uyamir's biggest customers were quartered in halls down near the main docks of the city. For 3 generations, the Vikings of Dublin had funded their city and warriors from selling slaves to both the Islamic Caliphate in Al-Andalus and several of the biggest independent kingdoms of the Afric, and many powerful and wealthy kings had representatives present in the city. He bid his mother and brothers farewell and made his way down through the town. It was only a short 4-minute walk from his father's hall to the slavers' block on the dock. The streets were wide and bustling with people still. Several groups of men nodded at him in recognition and respect as he walked past. From what he was told by the older Vikings who remembered, he bore such a striking resemblance to his grandfather, Ivar the Boneless, that some of the more superstitious among them felt that Ragnar was a reincarnation. He used to laugh at that idea with his cousin Ingemundr, as if Ivar the Boneless shared the same sexual proclivities as Ragnar, there would have been no such thing as the Uya As Ragnar turned the final bend toward the slavers' block on the pier, he was glad to see that his young cousin Garanger had taken the initiative and begun leading up the slaves 6 at a time to the block. The first 6 were all mature women who were either too old to breed children or flawed in some way and would not make much money. These lots were quickly sold to the highest bidder. The 2 main competitors for the chattel were 2 men he recognized. The first was the Arab vizier Amir ibn Hafsun, a senior diplomat and procurer of slaves for the most holy emir of Cordoba, Abdullah ibn Muhammad. The emir and his vizier had a voracious appetite for female slaves, to work as both cooks and cleaners, but also to add as concubines to either the emir's own harem or those of his brothers, cousins, or friends. These women, Ragnar knew, could expect a life of luxury compared to a hard life working on Saxon farms, which was the contradiction faced by the captured slaves. Occasionally, Amir ibn Hafsun would work freelance and supply some of the other Islamic kingdoms far to the east, who all admired the strange pale flesh and light-coloured hair of some of the women of northwest Europe. He controlled a small fleet of 4 boats, manned by eunuch sailors, with eunuch Slavic soldiers providing security. Several of them accompanied the vizier now, wrapped up in pelts and furs to protect him from the Irish cold. The sails of the vizier's ships carried the same sickle-shaped sign of the Muslims and the arms of his master, and were easy to spot. Ragnar saw 4 tied up on the docks a few hundred feet away. This is good, thought Ragnar. He will be wanting to pack his holds full of slaves this early in the battle season, so he can make another run later in the summer. The second major customer that Ragnall acknowledged with a nod was the mighty nobleman and warrior of the Ghanaian kingdoms on the west coast of the Afric, Diaby Cissé. He had ebony skin as dark as coal, and his soldiers all shared the same look. He was one of a number of sons of Magan Majan, the current overlord of the province of Takrur. They were an incredibly wealthy nation who gathered their riches through the mining of gold and salt. What they required were numerous young boys and girls to wield pickaxes and climb into small dark crevices to chip wealth from the rock. Occasionally they would compete with the Arab representatives for any women the Dublin Vikings might capture, but only if they were of incredible beauty or noble birth. The few men that survived to land on Dublin slave blocks were usually gelded and sold to the Umayyad as strongbacks for various tasks. Other buyers occasionally frequented the blocks from the Viking world, but compared to those two exotic customers, they just didn't have the wealth to compete. The crowd was heaving today, Ragnall noticed, and as lots of slaves were produced to the block, inspected, and then bid for before being herded onto the ships of the buyers. He was surprised to see that the crowd did not dissipate even after the first 20 lots were sold. There were many faces present that Ragnall did not recognise. Most of the warriors of Dublin were away on campaign with Ragnall's father, and so the city was guarded and policed mostly from amongst the young and untested and the old, all commanded by a few seasoned men. His mother and the Earl Sigfrid usually sat in judgment late in the evening in the main hall on any pressing matters that affected the city of Dublin, but in terms of authority, that was about all there was. A particularly beautiful young woman with blonde hair appeared in the next lot, which caught everyone's eye. Ragnall ushered her gently to the front of the block away from the other 5 in her lot and signalled to the 2 heavy hitters to begin. 30 dirham from the Ghanaian was doubled by the Arab vizier. The Ghanaian nobleman considered for a moment before raising the price by another 10. The Arab shouted something derogatory to the Ghanaian and immediately bid another 10 for the girl. The Ghanaian, affronted by the arrogance of the Arab, raised the price by another 30. Both the Kingdom of the Afric and the Caliphates of the Islamic world have voracious appetites for Celtic and Saxon slaves, but sometimes they were so greedy and intent on a particular asset that Ragnall had to laugh. There were another 10,000 girls waiting to be raided just like her, and these greedy idiots want to beggar themselves over her. In the end, the Ghanaian won the bidding war for this beautiful girl for a colossal sum of 125 dirham. In disgust, the Arab vizier slunk away and instructed one of his underlings to bid on his behalf, his pride severely dented. Ragnall knew that the vizier had to hit a certain quota of slaves on each journey north, lest he face reprimand by his master, so he could not afford to blow all of his coin on a single piece of stock, unless he knew her great beauty would mesmerise one of the royal house. That would not be a sure thing, though. The Islamic world was an enormous place, but the Arabic tribes saw themselves as kings of it. A Frankian wine merchant had explained this to him. There were black Africans and Berbers of the Afric, Nubians and Egyptians, Turkic and Bulgar nomads, and Persians, who all called Allah their God, but the Arabs always considered themselves above the others. After all, their godling, Muhammad, had come from Arab stock. A Ghanaian nobleman outbidding the vizier for a slave was a slap in the face to the Arab vizier. Ragnall didn't care though. They were just customers to him, enriching his father's kingdom and by extension the city of Dublin. When finally the last lot of slaves, a group of young boys, were sold and paid for and packed away on ships, Ragnall had his men count the gold and then sent a few reliable warriors to accompany it up to the main hall. All his warriors that had raided with him took their cut as well, and Ragnall sent them on their way with his compliments on a raid well conducted. They would spend 2 weeks with their wives and families, and then they would take to the seas once more, but this time to sail up the Severn River to support his cousin Inga Munder to keep the Saxons guessing. Evening was falling rapidly and grey clouds were gathering above the Dublin skies, but Ragnall had this feeling that something was amiss. Why is it so damn busy? He looked around trying to identify people he knew, but that was virtually impossible in a city this size. He started walking again up toward the hall of his father and stood in the main thoroughfare, looking around in a circle. A pair of flat-topped wagons almost ran over his foot, and he hopped out of the way in annoyance at the carelessness of it. The two men leading it were hooded and issued an apology in Irish, and continued on their way towards the docks. When Ragnar looked around more studiously, he saw that a lot of people were hooded as if bracing for bad weather, but the skies were iron grey. There was no rain yet. There were a lot of men around, he thought, on both sides of the river too, from his memory of sailing into port. Way more than there should be at this time of the year, with the bulk of the warriors in campaign. A glint of metal caught his eye in one of the wagons that had nearly ran him over, from just beneath the furs piled inside it. He saw another trio of men, hooded as well, meet with the two leading the wagons, and the five spoke furtively together. Oh no, Ragnar thought. Surely not today. He slowly drew his two axes from his belt and walked back toward them, a surety growing in him that something was appallingly wrong. One of the men reached into the back wagon and pulled away the furs and unveiled dozens of weapons lying on its floor. Ragnar was now jogging when the others reached in and began pulling weapons too. Ragnar was sprinting. The men were pulling back their hoods and discarding their cloaks when Ragnar hit them. He plunged his right-hand axe through the spine of the first man and decapitated the second with a blow from his left hand. He kicked the third back into the dirt to give himself room to split the skull of the fourth. The fifth attempted to free a dagger from his breeches, but Ragnar split him from sternum to groin, and his intestines spilled out on the earth. He died noisily, and the ordinary people of Dublin finally registered that something was awry. There were men dying before them on the street. They must be under attack. Ragnar chopped the right hand of the man he had kicked to the ground and put his axe to his throat. "Are we under attack?" he screamed at the injured man who was groaning in agony beneath him. Before he received an answer from him, a thunderous horn echoed across the city of Dublin, and it was answered by another and another and another. Silence descended momentarily, and then the scream started. He buried his axe in the man's face. "The Irish are within the walls." Ragnar knew time was of the essence. If these Irish had any tactical sense, they would make straight for his father's hall and make prisoners of any of the Uya nobility there. He sprinted up the streets toward his father's abode. He saw Norse-Gael Dublin people slowly come to their senses and pick up arms to defend themselves, but it was obvious to Ragnar that it would be too late. The dregs of the warriors remaining in Dublin, apart from his own warriors, were only capable of perhaps defending the walls, but against a horde of Irish warriors they were badly outmatched. He still couldn't believe it. No Irish army had ever taken the city of Dublin, but it was happening now. They had not only picked the most opportune time to attack, with more than 6,000 of its warriors abroad, but they had also managed to sneak probably hundreds of men through the walls and wooden palisades through subterfuge, bribery, and probably murder. Ragnar's fury got the better of him on multiple occasions, and he rushed to intercept the occasional Irish attacker racing past. He slew 3 or 4 before he got to the front doors of his mother's hall, but to his horror, he saw that it had been splintered and kicked in already. The Irish had been here. A shudder associated with an unfamiliar emotion crept over him. It was fear. Both of his axes were bloody, and his mail was covered with mud and gore. It made the grip on the hafts of his axes less than solid. On entering, he found a piece of cloth and wiped both handles down. The room was dark, so he opened the doors fully to let the maximum of the evening's daylight in to illuminate the hall. It was a bloodbath. There were 2 Viking warriors dead on the ground, one with his throat slit and another who had the top portion of his head caved in with his brains on the rushes. And then there came the worst sight of all. His mother, sword in hand, with a snarl on her lips, lay with a dagger buried in her breast that had impaled her to the main wooden bench. There were 2 Irishmen dead on the floor too. Neither of Ragnar's twin brothers were amongst the slain. Ragnar's fury rose inside him like a volcano. "These Irish will pay," he fumed. "This is an outright brazen attack on Dublin. The sheer hubris of these Irishmen to take Dublin like this." He shouted loudly, and he swore that by Thor's hammer he would have vengeance on the Irish. A whimper from behind a pile of chopped logs caught his attention. He ran toward the sound and looked behind the wood. It was his brother Godfred. The boy leaped into Ragnar's arms, shaking with terror. He was just a young child and had witnessed his mother being slaughtered. Godfred whispered into Ragnar's ear between sobs, They have taken Citric. They have taken Citric. Ragnall picked up his terrified young brother and ran for the exit. The city was in chaos. Ragnall could see people being massacred, women being raped, and children being butchered like sheep by crazed Irish warriors. The priority for Ragnall was to get his terrified young brother Godfred out to sea in the hands of his cousins, and then try and find out the location of Citric. He prayed to Odin that the boy was captured and taken hostage rather than killed, but the blood was up in the Irish warriors that he had seen, and all they seemed concerned with was the sack of the city rather than the well-being of captives. Twice he had to put Godfred down to cut down a handful of warriors who stood in his path. He towered above them, as the Irish were of Celtic heritage and usually a good bit shorter than any Viking, especially a towering Ullmere nobleman like himself. When he encountered cadres of warriors that he was not sure that he could defeat, he took the side streets to get to evade them. He knew Dublin better than any Irishman ever could and easily avoided them. He could see, even from distance, that many Vikings and Norse Gaels were jumping onto their longboats and fleeing the massacre, which gladdened his heart. How has it come to this, he wondered. Most of the people of Dublin had some Irish in them, including himself, as the wife of his grandfather, Ivar the Boneless, was a sister of Flann Sinna, their High King. His father was wrong, clearly, in his assumption that the Kingdom of Dublin was on good terms with the Irish kingdoms that surrounded them. When I find out who is responsible for this, I will come back with every Viking I can find and put every man and woman to the sword and sell their children to the slave minds of the Ghanaians, he swore. He passed several of the minor market squares on his way to the docks, and he could see that hundreds, or maybe even thousands, of the people of Dublin were being herded under guard. At least the massacre has ceased, he thought, and they are content to take prisoners now. He paused to listen to the Irish captains bawling over the din, and he could make out what they were saying. They were shouting to the mass of subdued Dublin people that the city was taken, and if the people did not resist, they would not be harmed. He ground his teeth in frustration when he heard the proclamations of these criers, shouting that they were actually freeing the Norse Gael and Irish from the tyranny of the Ullmere, and that under the high kingship of Flann Sinna they would prosper under just rule. Lies, seethed Ragnall. The Ullmere made this city what it is. He couldn't listen to this filth any more, and moved on with Godfred in his arms. The boy was heavy, so he eventually had to put him down. Once on the ground, Godfred surprisingly pulled his sleeve and asked Ragnall for a dagger to fight. He explained that he and Citric had hidden the Saracen swords that Ragnall had given them, so their mother would not confiscate them. Ragnall could see the grim determination being summoned on his brother's face despite his fear. Tears almost welled in Ragnall's eyes, and he had to look away at the shocking bravery being shown by the boy. Ullmere to the bone, this one. Our mother would be proud. The two brothers jogged downhill through the back alleys to the river Liffey. At length, Ragnall and Godfred reached the docks. The bodies of Irish warriors and Vikings littered the ground, but Garangar, Ragnall's young cousin, held the docks still. Hurry, Ragnall, he shouted. Dublin has all but fallen. They have subdued the city and both banks of the river. Already 300 boats have cast off with thousands of our people. Ragnall nodded. A large portion of our strength has been preserved, and whatever has been taken from us can always be taken back, he thought. He loaded his brother onto one of the remaining longboats and told Garangar to leave one last boat under guard with 10 men and to round up another 20 of the remaining warriors. They were going back into the city to try and rescue Citric, or at least ascertain his fate. All other boats were to leave immediately and reconvene the next morning off the eastern shore of Lambay Island. Apart from the Dalnaridi clan of the Uled, the Irish were not a sea power, and the people of Dublin would be safe from the attackers on the water, he knew. Once the 20 men were assembled, Ragnall led them west down the banks of the river in search of Citric. The sound of violence was dying down around the city, and the conflict was almost done. Dublin was firmly under Irish control. Smoky clouds had gathered above several buildings that had been fired in the chaos. Ragnall noticed that at every street front bunches of Irish warriors had assembled to witness as 20 warriors jogged past, but he did not try advance and just stared after them. Street after street they crossed. They were marked, but not challenged by any band of Irish fighters. Ragnall slowed to a walk and then stopped. It dawned on him. They know we are coming. Between the quickly darkening evening and the pall of smoke, visibility was much reduced. but Ragnar could make out a shadow emerging ahead of them along the main thoroughfare that flanked the Liffey. His warriors fanned out in a circle to protect him, as finally the Irish soldiers made a move to encroach upon them. The shadow in the smoke was not one person, but several. The first to emerge from the gloom were his younger brother Citric, who was deeply distressed and scared, and an elderly but powerfully built grey-haired man. The man's arm was firmly wrapped around Citric's shoulder. This man is familiar to me, thought Ragnar. It was Flann Sinna, the High King of Ireland, and the head of the southern Uí Néill. The hair stood up on his arm and his Viking blood stirred. I am related to this man. If I cut him down now before his men get to me, I will go down forever in the sagas as the Viking who put the High King of Ireland to the sword. That ambition withered away when his sister Bodil emerged from the smoke as well, Ragnar's nephew in her arms. He stared at Ragnar pleadingly, and he inferred from that look that the wrong word could see 3 members of the Uí Néill slain in less than a minute. He sheathed his axes, and with a nod his men did too. 3 other men emerged to stand beside Bodil, Citric, and the High King. Ragnar knew them all. They were his treacherous brother-in-law, Alguera Macalele, Maelfinia MacFlanacon, the King of Brega, neighbour of Dublin to the north, and Kerbal MacMurracon, the King of Leinster to the south. All served as under-kings to Flann Sinna. It was the High King who spoke first. Ragnar Iverson, grandnephew, I want you to not speak, but listen. If you utter a single word, or you or your men make one threatening move, your young brother will have to die here and now, blood ties to me or not. Ragnar trembled with rage. He could only nod. Dublin is an independent kingdom no more, Ragnar. They will pay obeisance and tribute to me like all the rest from this day forward. I will now protect these people, not the Uí Néill. You have my word that I will not brutalize them, subjugate them, or enslave them. Mine is the Christian way, not the Viking or Muslim way. You will carry word to your father, my nephew, that I will keep his son Citric as hostage, as his bond of good conduct. The kings of Leinster have 2 of his sisters. Their husbands love them dearly, but they will pay the ultimate price also if Ivar disobeys me. Citric will be raised in my hall and receive an education worthy of an Irish nobleman. He will come to no harm as long as the Uí Néill troubles us no more. The old king paused momentarily and pulled his iron grey hair from his weather-beaten face. Ultimately, Ragnar, the rule of Dublin is mine now. The days of the Uí Néill slaving Irish people are over. Peaceful reign, and the people of Dublin will pay tribute to me. Except for the more notable barbarians amongst your ranks, the rest of the Norse Gael are free to come and go and visit loved ones or even trade. But I will tax you and reinforce the city against counterattack. Kerbal MacMurracon will oversee the administration of Dublin on my behalf from this day forward. It saddens me to be forced to usurp people of my own blood, but the Irish can no longer endure Viking tyranny. The Uí Néill will no longer rule this city. I will. His mother dead, his brother and sisters effectively taken captive, Ragnar could summon no adequate response. He turned his back on Dublin and sailed out of the estuary of the Liffey an hour later. The Uí Néill will return, he vowed. Flann Sinna will pay.